So we're in the process of unveiling this approach that we have to teaching that I have kind of coined and called the 13 pillars of highly effective teaching. In New York, there's a mandated teacher assessment tool that administrators use through observations, and to the highest level you can score is highly effective. And I joke with my administrators and I say, I don't want to be highly effective, I want to be highly affective. So, and that's kind of a little bit of a play on words and a twist for the work that we're doing with Sweethearts and Heroes. But I stand by it. And the 13 pillars, I think, really show why that is meaningful to me to be more affective. I think in the Bloom's taxonomy that every educator experiences in their undergrad work, when they're looking at the 3 domains, we focus a lot on, the cognitive and the psychomotor. I'm a phys ed teacher, so mostly mine was in the psychomotor and cognitive second, but the affective has always been don't run with scissors, don't swear, be respectful, be a citizen, and that kind of stuff. And I think really the affective domain is to instill within your students, whether it's a kindergartner or a 12th grader and everything in between, the appreciation, love, and value for whatever discipline it is or whatever lesson it is that you're teaching them. So I aspire, to reach highly affective, and it's the 13 pillars of highly affective teaching. And then we do a little twist on the word pillar and soften it up to pillow. And we use a strategy and a technique to be more reflective, because one of the things that I learned through my teaching career and even in my personal relationships and my athletic career in college is to be reflective is really to be a high performer and achieve the best version of yourself. So I consistently question my impact in whatever endeavor and reflect on that. So we use this pillow test technique. So that is, we have a book, and the title is 13 Pillars of Highly Effective Teaching, but we quickly changed the title early on, and probably the cover is going to be crossed out and say, pillows for highly effective.
And really the whole notion of pillows as athletes, as collegiate athletes and more, I was given this pillow test years ago by a psychologist from Montclair State University called the pillow test. And he said, when you lay your head down on the pillow at night, you have to say one of 2 things. I wish I had, or I'm glad I did. And inevitably, most of the time we lay our head down on the pillow at night and say, God, I wish I had gone to the gym. I wish I hadn't eaten that cookie. I wish I had done more. And you failed the pillow test. And truly, to become a better version of yourself, you have to lay your head down the pillow and say, man, I'm glad I put in those extra sprints. I'm glad I did. And what we found was, as we reflected on these points, these topics that Jason has worked on in himself for years, was there's a lot of times you talk about what you should do and you lay your head down on the pillow at night when you walk by that kid that you could have stopped and spoken to, but you're busy and life's in the way and your family's in the way and a lot of challenges going on, and you lay your head down that pillow and it just kind of pops into your head. Your subconscious sucks it out and says, oh, I wish I had. And the beauty of the pillow test is you get to wake up every day or go to bed every night failing the pillow test, and it resets. So the next morning when you get up, you can say, I'm going to talk to that kid, so that when you lay your head down the pillow at night, you can say, I'm glad I did. And I'll just kind of finish up with this, that each one of these pillars or pillows that we'll talk about, we challenge teachers that when you think about that one and you lay your head down that night, you say, I wish I had, or I'm glad I did. And that really brings this focus or this clarity into becoming a better version of an educator.
And I think when we made that connection from the sports psychology world to reflecting on your own performance and your own training and your own successes, I kind of made that link and said, where are some people underperforming as educators or low performing educators. And the only reason I know is because I was one of them, and I could reflect on my own impact and my own years of experience. And the development of this message and the work really started about 10 years ago. And I'm a 21-year veteran. So he likes to say the first 10 years I was doing it all wrong. I don't believe in that. I was probably scoring highly effective. But truth be told, I could have done it much better. And it was when I became more reflective. And I think we have a tendency, erosion is just, you might hear me say that multiple times through this conversation on the 13 pillows, but I think what slows down the erosion process, because erosion is inevitable, it's Mother Nature, and this 30-something teacher who's thinking about retirement, that's too soon. They're eroding way too quickly. How do we slow that down? I think you got to become reflective in nature. So.
And I think if we're doing it the right way, you look back 10 years ago, you're sure you were doing it wrong.
Right.
Right? Yeah.
So we've broken up these pillows into 3 sections. And Jason kind of creatively, as we laid all these out one day, and we just used to just regurgitate them to teachers, and people would like pick through them, Jason came up with a common theme that there were like 3 really distinct categories that they fell into, and that's kind of what we'll lay out here.
Yeah, we hear the word climate a lot in schools now, and I think the first category is the climate-based pillows, and then I think there's a lot of great philosophy that goes into educating as a teacher. So the second segment or second section category would be philosophy, and the philosophical question is teaching an art or a science. So there's some philosophical pillars. Or pillows, and then the third category would be superpowers or tool belt pillows. And like you show up to work ready for anything because you got all your superpowers at your disposal and these neat tools you can just pull off of your belt during those really challenging situations.
So is the order of the pillars going to matter if you're going to start using them or understand them?
No,
okay.
Not at all. And the one thing that does matter, I believe, is, and we've talked a little bit about circles already. I think in order to show up and do the circle process justice requires some vulnerability on my part and a certain level of, I call it empathetic fitness on the part of the educator, is to show up and do something really uncomfortable. And that is to sit in a circle with students and not be able to control what comes out of their mouths, because it's much easier to teach your lesson. It's much more convenient to stick to the curriculum. So I think that the one thing about being able to reach highly effective teaching is to be comfortable being uncomfortable in certain parts of teaching that I would refer to as the soft skills.
Yeah, and I think role modeling empathy is one of the best things we can do for kids. And starting small so that you can even say to them, I'm going to be vulnerable here and I'll share something with you that's difficult, or here's something that I'm going through that's hard.
Exactly.
Yeah, kids respond to that.
So let's get right into the first group here, and it certainly revolves around climate and culture. We hear that all the time. I've spent 20 years in the business world, and everybody wants to walk into an amazing culture. And everybody has plans for an amazing culture, and it doesn't really work that way.
Right.
It takes years of climate change in order to change the culture. And I think the first thing I always point out to educators when I start to talk about these pillows, when we do seminars, is you understand the difference between climate and culture. And climate's kind of that every day. Is it raining outside right now? Is it sunny outside? And of course, everybody wants, beautiful 80-degree low humidity weather, but it takes a lot of effort to get there. And you got a lot of rainstorms and a lot of windstorms to weather to get there. And these initial set of pillows are really based on creating a climate that everybody wants, but going through, creating a culture that everybody wants, that's healthy and safe, but going through the daily climate. And these are things that you can use in your daily practice to affect the culture in the long run.
Yeah, I break climate and culture down similarly, but a little differently descriptive, is your climate is what people think and feel day to day. Like, I got math class. What are the feelings that are going through me, and what are the thoughts in my mind as I walk down the hall of math? Or I'm talking about math class to my mom or dad or friend, and what are the feelings and thoughts? I can tell you, my own son's math teacher, the thought is YouTube. That's how we learned geometry this year, YouTube videos. He didn't do too well on the New York State Regents exam, in his opinion. But, so that's the thought and feeling that we have in the Spector household, right? So I think the culture is what you know and believe. It's like the value system that's created based on the experience that you're getting. So, when people talk over the fence to their neighbor, they have this belief about the school. And it's based solely on their personal experiences that are derived from the way they think and feel on a regular basis. So for me, as a teacher, I want to send kids home thinking and feeling the right kinds of thoughts about our climate. And eventually, I think over time, that's when the culture gets created and what people know and believe about us and the work that I do is in my classroom.
Okay. Tell me about your classroom and what you're teaching right now.
So Tom will joke and call me the gym teacher, and in phys ed circles, it's you're supposed to refer to yourself as a physical educator, and I've never really been offended by being called a gym teacher, but I think if I were to describe myself, I'm a physical education teacher. I teach high school physical education currently. I've been a K through 12 though. These last 2 years are my first 2 years teaching high school. I spent most of my career in middle school, and then 5 years at the beginning of my career, I was in middle school and elementary. So I've seen every grade level. I've been fortunate enough to experience that, and if I have to impress people, if I'm around a table with some high-level professionals, I'll say that I'm a peak performance strength and conditioning coach. And essentially that's what I am, but basically a lot of my daily practices are in a weight room setting, working on strength and conditioning for the athlete that competes and the athlete that is non-competitive, because every human is an athlete. Just moving through space requires some level of balance and timing and rhythm. So I believe everyone is athletic. It's just whether you choose to be competitive or not.
So kind of the first pillow that we think sets the tone in terms of developing a climate and a culture that's, sweethearts and heroes friendly. I don't know if that's the right way to put it, but it's this whole notion of when a teacher comes in to understand that it's a marathon, not a sprint. And it's so easy for especially a young teacher watching this or getting this information from us to want to sprint, because the gym coach over here, when he first started out, he was trying to sprint kids to and through the finish line. And it took him a while to figure it out, but in this first pillow, the marathon versus a sprint kind of outlines the process.
Yeah, and I remember this, you just made me think of it. When early on in my career, I would think of, all these sayings and cliches and mantras and things that inspired me, and I just remember coaching 9th grade football. It was my first probably 2 or 3 years teaching, and the saying, you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make it drink. And, dealing with 9th graders, that probably comes to mind quite a bit. You lead 9th graders to water and you can't get them to. And I used to have this visual mindset that I can take that horse by the neck and stick its face in the water and show it that it can drink. That was I was forced learning, and that was part of how I was doing it wrong, reflecting back on the mindset. But you know what? That's how it was done to me. And that was what made me successful, but that doesn't necessarily mean it works for everyone. So that was part of my maturation. But early on, it was probably about 8 years ago, in my coaching career in wrestling in the current district that I'm in, the unthinkable happened. I unfortunately experienced a wrestler in my wrestling program as a junior made the decision to end his life. And for me, as it is for anyone, it was an eye-opener and brought me to a level, a personal level and a professional level that was extremely challenging on all fronts. And I thought I did a pretty decent job at dealing with some of the triage that happens in a team situation when that kind of tragedy. And I'd be foolish to think that many people watching this haven't had their own types of tragedies, whether it be suicide or something else similar. But for me, when we lost, his name was Evan, when we lost Evan, it was quite a process. And one of the reasons that I never saw coming was because in the morning, the day after, I had done all the hard work of supporting my team and following up and making phone calls and even going to a few of their houses and having conversations, making sure everybody was okay. The next morning, I was actually relieved to go into my teaching space and start classes because I taught in the middle school and Evan was a high school junior, so I was getting a little bit of a break from the stress. So I was setting up my gym, and my principal came in and said, "You got to go to the high school. You're going to be one of the grief counselors." And
wow.
Made sense. I just didn't expect it. Right. So on my drive to the high school, I was like panicking a little bit, like, what the heck am I going to do with grief counseling? Like, what does it even mean to be a grief counselor? I'd never experienced it. So I go into the library, which is where kids were allowed to go for grieving if they felt like they couldn't go to class. And the part that I always have to tell during this part of the story is Monday we lost 2 students to a tragic car accident. And my wrestler Evan made the unthinkable decision on Thursday.
Wow.
And
That's a tough week.
Yeah, very tough. And the library was full of kids grieving the 2 students we lost on Monday, and then now these new students who were friends with Evan. And what was really awkward was they were 2 very different groups of students. So I started conversations. I was uncomfortable as anybody, but I was like, I'm not gonna, be uncomfortable. I got to take some action here. And Sweethearts and Heroes actually existed for about 3 years prior to that. So I had a little bit of momentum with our message of hope and action. So I put to use some of the work that we had been doing with our students, and we had some good conversations, and people started to talk. No one was talking for the first, 40 minutes of being in the library. So the administrators and the counselors said, "Oh, you're really good at this. You gotta do us a favor." And I said, "What do you mean?" And everybody's talking. I was like thinking my day was over. And they said, "Well, it's only 3rd period. We need someone to maybe walk Evan's schedule because there's kids that aren't in the library who are in his class, and it's very uncomfortable. And we thought maybe it would be helpful if you were kind of there and you could go and take off some of the stress and anxiety or whatever." So I was like, whoa.
You have some bold administration at your school, huh?
Thanks for saying that.
Yeah.
So I said, sure, let's do it. And I went into each classroom, and that was the most powerful professional development experience of my career, because even though I had been doing Sweethearts and Heroes work for 3 years, I called him at the end of that day and I said, "You won't believe it. Kids don't commit suicide." Now, this is my belief. This is what I learned that day. I said, "Tom, kids don't commit suicide because of bullying, because of any one thing in their circumstance in their life." And that's a heavy statement. That's a big deal. And that's what people automatically assume when there's a suicide. He was bullied. And Evan didn't have anything specifically in his life that was like a red flag. He was obviously hopeless. He was obviously suicidal, and no one knew it. But what I said to him, I said, any case, and I started thinking about other cases and other situations and people self-harming. It's not about that tragic home situation. It's not about that tough existence. It's not about all the things that certainly mix in to create hopelessness. It's about the lack of Sweethearts and Heroes. Because every seat around Evan's empty chair looked guilty. Every face, every kid. The kids who had projects that were unfinished on the windowsill, even the teacher, even the wrestling coach who was sharing stories about Evan and honoring his memory and trying to create some normalcy out of this really unique day and sad and tragic experience, felt and looked guilty. And that's the unfairness of suicide, is that, there's this feeling of would've, could've, should've.
Sure.
And I said to him,
anytime a child dies, kids aren't supposed to die, so it's
right.
really hard to make sense of loss, and our community has seen a lot of that.
So I had this kind of like validation and epiphany. I said, the answer is more sweethearts and heroes, more trained people that won't say would have, could have, or should have, because they do. They know how to. They have the skill set to do that. So we got to train more people to carry hope for others. We got to train more people to take action. That's what sweethearts and heroes do. They're hope carriers and action takers. And it just became so clear that kids don't naturally know how to do that. So that was when I really felt like, for me, the loss of Evan, as tragic and as you know, the one thing I always include in that story is, fortunately, I had only spent a week with him. It was a week into the season. And, you know, by a month in, I have an intimate relationship with every athlete in my program, and I know everything there is to know about their home life. I know everything academically. I have all their motivational tricks and, you know, all kinds of carrots and stick strategies to get them to do what I need them to do and support them. But I had only seen them for 4 days. So that was kind of let me off the hook as far as like feeling like I could have and should have and would have done more.
Sure.
Now, where do I go with that lesson? Well, I started coaching differently. I started seeing my purpose differently, even 3 years into our message. And ironically, coincidentally, I had a kid show up as a 10th grader. His name was Devin. Devin rhymes with Evan. And this kid, Devin, was definitely the worst candidate to join the wrestling team as a 10th grader. It's a very tough sport to start late. He starts the season.
I see Tom shaking his head here.
No.
He starts the season as a 10th grader. Tom knows the ending to the story. He starts the season as a 10th grader, never having wrestled. Very thin, you know, kind of a wimpy looking kid, for lack of a better description. And he was a special ed student. The special ed teacher dragged him into the room and just kind of left him there. And I said, well, he doesn't even have any shoes. What are we going to? He wrestled in socks for like 3 days, and we found him some shoes. But my team and my program by that time had kind of changed, and we became very accepting and very welcoming and very accommodating to different types and different people. Even a kid who would like the last thing he should be doing is wrestling. And he proved it, because he didn't win a match all year. Until the end of the year, we were at a school. It was a makeup date, and I was a little too engaged in his match as a JV wrestler. I was the varsity coach, and I was just all fired up and emotional because it was like a real high-scoring match, and there was like a terrible display of wrestling and technique, which I pride myself on as being able to teach my guys how to wrestle. So he lost, and he had this giant ear-to-ear grin, and I'm furious that he's smiling, because you don't smile when you lose in wrestling. It's just kind of an unwritten rule. And he comes running back. I said, why are you smiling? And he's completely exhausted, and he's breathing heavy and snot coming out of his nose. And he's like, that's the first time I made it all 6 minutes. So here I was, this, you know, reformed, you know, thinking differently, trying to implement Sweethearts and Heroes, rules of connection and hope and action. And I'm still not fully there in my maturation development, because I'm angry at this kid. I'm trying to make him win when all he was looking to do was survive.
Hang in.
And that's when the marathon versus sprint was born.
How did the loss of Evan change your coaching? You mentioned that you changed the way you coach, but can you talk about specifically what changed?
Right, to summarize it, I mean, when I do professional development, I have a slide that shows Mr. Billy Bob Thornton plays the part of Mr. Woodcock in like this horrible phys ed movie. Mm-hmm. And I certainly wouldn't like say that I captured that, but I had this turn boys into men, make men into leaders, and build champions mindset. Mm-hmm. And it makes sense. You know, fitness is certainly really important, right? But you think a 10-year-old really cares about fitness and running the mile and how many push-ups they can do, or a 17-year-old, or, you know, a 7-year-old. And certainly there's ways to implement that. But I was very focused on, you know, fitness and athletics and recruiting and trying to bring kids down the track I went down. Mm-hmm. And I think that my coaching and teaching both shifted through the experience of Evan's, you know, tragedy, and seeing that, you know, there's kids that have a story and they could be hurting, and it's really important for us to accept them. And I asked Devin, because later in his career, his senior year, he was 31-3. He only lost 3 matches as a senior. He took third in our state qualifier. And I said, Devin, you should have quit. Any other kid would have quit. I've seen, tons of kids over my career coaching wrestling quit the sport. It's just part of the attrition rules. And I said, why didn't you quit? And I have he's like a son to me. I said, you should have quit. You didn't. Why are you so different? And he said, it's the first time I've ever felt accepted in my whole life. And I can name 2 kids that accepted him. And I'll bring up one later on another pillow, but Brandon and Zach. And as the story comes full circle, I just helped Devin write his best man speech for Zach at his wedding 2 weeks ago. So it's pretty fascinating.
Were there just boys in your PE classes?
I speak a lot about boys. Now I teach male and female, but most of my middle school career was male. So we separated with some co-ed experiences, but for the most part, most of my career, 13 years, I taught just boys. And you want to talk about locker rooms? I got stories.
So give me an example of something that you put into place right away after the loss of Evan, and you realized that you wanted to have your wrestling program be an experience of inclusion and acceptance. What did you do differently?
I started taking more time understanding, how kids were feeling, and not trying to take their head and shove it in the water to make them drink, like that horse saying I mentioned. We were hugging and high-fiving and shaking hands at the end of every practice. A lot of bro hugs, and then some kids would embrace.
With a good loud slap in there.
Yeah. So, but I stole that from jiu-jitsu, martial arts, grappling sports. It's tradition at the end of every grappling practice, they go through like a line so that every participant hugs every participant before they leave the gym. So
it's pretty powerful stuff when you are seen and heard, even if it's just as simple as some kind of human connection.
Exactly.
And I think to kind of wrap up marathon versus a sprint, this is the question that we ask, especially young teachers or teachers that are themselves sprinting towards the finish line, that it's easier to just want to get this kid over the finish line, pass the grade, move on to the next one. And it constantly, Jason has to remind himself and other teachers that every kid you deal with, it's a marathon. You have a brain that isn't formed. You have skills that they don't know. Be careful when you try to make them sprint instead of taking them through the marathon that they deserve to be taken through, sometimes with a lot of patience from a teacher. So that's kind of the beauty of the marathon versus the sprint. When you lay your head down on the pillow at night, I'm certain that most teachers, or a lot of teachers, can say, oh, I failed that one. I wish I hadn't pushed that kid like that. I wish I had taken the time to really listen and understand instead of trying to get them to sprint over that little finish line.
So how do you respond to a teacher who's teaching to the Regents exam in New York State, or to a Vermont teacher who's trying to teach a proficiency, and you say to them, it's a marathon, not a sprint, and they say yes, but they just have to pass this test, or they just have to get this material. That's my job, is to teach them math or history or science.
And I carry that little bit of a self-conscious consciousness around, because I'm just the gym teacher. I don't have to adhere to those state tests, but I have yet to see anyone get fired because a kid failed the Regents. And I honestly believe that kids will pass if they're meant to pass. I could tell you a story of 4 or 5 seniors. They all passed, and they were on track not to. That just this school year alone, they were my students, and they were like, we had I'm almost embarrassed to say it, over 50 kids that were like one test failure away from potentially not graduating. I couldn't tell you how many made it through, but I know the guidance was on pins and needles days after the Regents exams. But I could tell you 3 or 4 kids that made it through. They're gonna make it through if they wanna make it through. And I say this, and I have to remind myself of this multiple times some days. We gotta stop taking ourselves so seriously. And if I connect with that kid, the chances of them passing the Regents are far greater than if I give them a 0 on their homework, or if I rant and rave, or if I hold them after school 4 days, over 2 weeks, or if I tell their coach to bench them. And I think that, if you think about a dog in dog training, it's all positive reward based. And that's hard to do because you feel like kids can get away with things, especially if you start going down the road of discipline. And you didn't really ask me that. We're talking about achievement and regents exams, state tests. State testing, most kids don't even take the state test, it feels like, anymore, right? Parents give them permission to not to take it. It's a big issue in New York where I teach. But I still don't know of any teachers that scored low because on their teacher evaluation or their teacher assessment, the low score on a state test has gotten them, a low enough score where they weren't able to keep their job.
So when you say marathon versus sprint, what do you mean is not a sprint? What do you not sprint? What should you stop sprinting?
Well, so a good example, I started teaching in high school, advanced placement, peak performance, strength and conditioning. It was an advanced placement class, so it wasn't for everyone. Now, they couldn't necessarily keep people out, but you had to know coming in, if you chose this, it should look more like a practice for strength and conditioning and peak performance than it would look like a gym class. And so it was a bit of a culture shock for some kids. And I had a girl that came in and she didn't like the idea of some of the positions that you have to put yourself in a squatting position. And she melted down because I'm teaching the class, I'm giving the instruction, and she the whole time is building up this anxiety and fear based on the fact that she thought she was going to have to do it. And so when I got done with my squat lesson and explained what you do and some troubleshooting and then said, okay, now here's where I want you to go, and people start moving freely through the space, she made a beeline for the door and went out in the hallway and was in tears. Turns out she has a history of some stuff in her childhood that make her uncomfortable in those positions in her body. And I didn't need to know all the details. I could tell immediately. And I probably, to do it over again, I would give a disclaimer at the beginning of that instruction and realize that the population I have could have some issues with some of the positioning. And so that was a learning experience for me. But not everybody has to squat. That's a thing. Not everybody has to work on their legs. There's reasons why some people can't. So for me, my class is bench, squat, deadlift are the, royal exercises. It's also grit, mindset, and presence on the psychological part of things. But it's okay if you can't do one of the royal movements, and that might have needed to be said earlier. Mm-hmm. So, and I have kids that come in that don't want to do anything, that have taken the class because they don't want to do the traditional PE experience. They don't want a volleyball flying at their face. They don't want to chase after a soccer ball. They don't care about games. So they're like, I'll try this. And they get in my class and they're meeting me with resistance and they want to hide. They want to take it easy. Now, wait, this is advanced placement. So I got to not take my title of my class so seriously and realize I got this kid for 10 months and it's only October. It's only November. It might only be February. And that girl that I referred to, it's been 2 years, she squats today. They're the boy that I was just thinking of who I met with resistance. And I said, it's only October. It's only February. At the end of the year, I had 70% effort out of him. Mm-hmm. That's a huge, but I had to let him go his own pace. And in the beginning,
you have to back off.
In the beginning, he was comatose. Mm-hmm. But at the end, he was moving. So that's what I mean, and that's how I apply it.